Alrighty, today scholars, we're in my classroom to learn about the introduction to macroeconomics. I have my smartboard, I have my chalkboard, and it's vacation week. When we talk about macroeconomics, the best way to start off is what macroeconomics used to be. It used to be called the dismal science. They called it the dismal science because macroeconomists would never do anything. They believed in laissez-faire, hands-off. The key idea in economics was hands-off, don't get involved in the economy, don't do any decision-making, don't do anything. The economy will always adjust itself. So we have pictures here of Herbert Hoover. Trust me, prosperity is right around the corner. I'm ruined. Well, maybe not this corner, it's a picture of Wall Street. Herbert Hoover, who was President of the United States from 1928 to 1932, really was one of the worst, most unfortunate presidents. He came in at the worst economic situation the United States have ever seen. And he was totally ill-prepared for it because of classic macroeconomic thinking. Eventually, John Maynard Keynes changed that economic thinking. And when we talk about macroeconomics, we're talking about the study of the behavior and decision-making for an entire economic system. Micro focused on individual units such as businesses and people. Macro talks about the entire economy, everything. So when we do that, we always start off macroeconomics with a little bit of a lesson from TV Land. If we could open it, that'll help. And this is a classic show that was very popular during the 70s.
In Hollywood. Boy, the way Glenda looked away. Noise like us we had it made. Noise like the days.
And you when you want it.
That's when there's a never again. Next to me to use a man like Glenda Hoover again. And there's no welfare states.
Everybody calls his way.
G.R.O. the siren ring. Knows what
Alright, classic Carol O'Connor and Gene Stapleton singing Those Were the Days. And the idea in that song you hear is we didn't need a welfare state. Everybody pulled his weight. Even the old LaSalle ran great. Mister, can we have a man like Herbert Hoover again? The problem was that before the Great Depression, back in the 1800s and before in the 1700s, when the economy was in bad shape, people lived on farms, so they didn't starve to death. They may have suffered, they may have been very thin, they may have, not really done well during economic downturns. But the farm community itself was the welfare system for our nation. Once we became urbanized and everybody was living in urban areas and cities, there became huge problems because now when you lost your job, there was no unemployment insurance, there was no food stamps, there was no temporary assistance or welfare for people. You literally starved to death. And during the Great Depression, tens of thousands of Americans literally starved to death. Economists said there's no such thing as unemployment. Well, there was unemployment. It was right there in the streets. Economists said, oh, don't worry, because generally what would happen is, if we just take a quick drawing here, here's price, here's quantity, okay? Here is aggregate demand, the total demand for all goods and services at all price levels. And really over here we have price level and real GDP. You may see the screen a little elongated. That's because I have a fisheye lens to make this a little bit wider to get both screens in. And over here we have aggregate supply, the total supply of all goods and services available at all price levels. According to a classic economist, what would happen is as aggregate demand dropped and kept going further and further and further inward, eventually prices would get so cheap that people would say, hey, look, it's so cheap to hire people, it's so cheap to buy stuff, let's buy it. And that would get aggregate demand to go back to where it's supposed to be. Because the classic problem of classical economists was very simple. They always believed we were at a position called full employment. And full employment means everybody's working. There's no such thing as unemployment. The only thing that causes unemployment are natural disasters. But the economy itself would always be at full employment. And that's the key mistake when we talk about classical economic thinking. But then what happened during the 1930s, with the bottom dropping out, Hoover promised everybody chicken in every pot in 1928. What was the purpose of that? The idea was, in 1928, believe it or not, chicken was more expensive than lobster. Chicken was considered gentleman's food. It was very high-end, very high quality. It was very difficult to grow chickens to slaughter weight. Usually it takes 6 months. Now, thanks to bioengineering and all that stuff, we get them in 6 weeks. But chicken was a premium product, so it's promising everybody continued prosperity. But as the economy went into the toilet, and we had unemployment rates, probably, nobody really knows. They say 20, 30%, 20% is really what they got at, but it's probably up to 50% because so many people were just on the move. It was very hard to count. People like John Maynard Keynes said, there has to be unemployment. I'm looking outside and seeing unemployment. Hey, wait, I think we have a message from Mr. Keynes right now. If we could open it.
Hello, my name is Adam Smith. I am regarded as the father of modern economics.
Adam Smith first. Sorry.
I was born in Kirkcaldy, Scotland in 1723. My most famous book is The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. In it, I write that rational self-interest in a free market economy leads to economic well-being. It is not for the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we can expect our dinner, but from their regard of their own self-interest. Man intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which is no part of his intention. Someone earning money by his own labour benefits himself. Unknowingly, he also benefits society, because to earn income on his labour in a competitive market, he must produce something others value. Similarly, an individual will invest a resource, for example, land or labour, so as to earn the highest possible return on it. Consequently, all uses of the resource must yield an equal rate of return, adjusted for the relative risk of each enterprise. Otherwise, reallocation would result. This idea is the central proposition of economic theory. The main cause of prosperity is increasing division of labour. I believe that economic development is best fostered in an environment of free competition that operates in accordance with universal natural laws. After a successful academic career and working as a tutor to the young Jacob Hugh, I was appointed Commissioner of Customs in 1778. I died, alas, in Edinburgh on July the 19th, 1790.
Now that was the classical idea according to Adam Smith, okay, and The Wealth of Nations. And I love that alliteration. It's not because of the benevolence of the butcher, or the baker that we get our dinner, but because they want to earn their own money. And Smith is right, but in an industrialized society where we don't have the welfare state of farms taking care of people, there needed to be a little bit more. Now, the classical economic theory is based on these 4 ideas: that always pure competition exists, wages and prices are flexible, people are motivated by their self-interest, and people cannot be fooled by the money illusion. The truth is, pure competition doesn't exist, and we knew that in the 1920s because of the existence of monopolies. Wages and prices are not flexible. They're what John Maynard Keynes called sticky, because of things like unions. Eventually, when wages get so low, people don't even bother to work. They don't bother to look for those jobs. They become what's called discouraged. They become discouraged workers who are no longer willing to enter the job market. Right now in the United States economy, even though unemployment is going down to about 6.6, 6.7%, we only have a labor force participation rate of about 50%. That's because our economy is loaded with people who have now become discouraged. They are no longer looking for work because it's not worth it to them, because wages are so low. So that gets rid of the first two. Yes, people are motivated by their self-interest. There's no doubt about that. And everybody, including me, is motivated by my self-interest. Right? Everybody does things for themselves in the long run. Even people who cater to others and help others, like teachers or people like volunteers who volunteer at soup kitchens, eventually that helps themselves and makes themselves feel good. And that's part of the self-interest. That's correct. But people cannot be fooled by the money illusion. The money illusion is the idea if you give somebody a raise at 5%, but inflation is 20%, they'll be so happy that they're making more money. Well, that's not true. People know that if I get a 5% raise, but inflation's at 20%, I am right now losing 15% of that income. So I'm only making negative 15% of where I was. So I'm making less and working more, so I don't want to work. So that's another idea that was wrong by the classical economists. A real-life example of that is right now, if you have a savings account, you're earning about 0.5% in that savings account. Well, the inflation rate is like 1.5%. So every year that you keep that money in the savings account, technically you're losing 1% of its value because it's not keeping pace with inflation. But you keep that money in a savings account because it's safe there. Okay? But this is the key. They always felt all resources were in full employment. So if all resources were in full employment, the government never has to interfere. But we learned because of the Great Depression that the government does. When we focus on macroeconomics, we're really going to be looking at mostly the American economy and free market economies. We're not going to do comparative economics, that's upper level. We're not going to look at really what socialism is, what communism is, things like that. We're going to focus really on the American system. Okay. The idea was the role of government should be minimal. It should be limited to trade agreements, is what the classical economists thought. But all this was causing so much pain and suffering to the American society, this classical idea, when all these needs were so great during the Great Depression, that a new idea stepped forward. And that was the idea of John Maynard Keynes. And he's here to speak as well.
Hello, my name is John Maynard Keynes. I was born in Cambridge on the 5th of June 1883. I was educated at Eton and then King's College, Cambridge. I entered the British Civil Service for a little while and then returned to Cambridge in 1909. From 1914 to 1918, I was called to the Treasury to assist with the financing of the British war economy. I excelled at my job, and the influence I gained earned me a position with the British delegation to the Versailles Peace Conference in 1918. I was appalled at the vindictive nature of the peace settlement and was particularly opposed to the devastating consequences of the heavy reparations payments imposed on Germany. So I resigned from the conference. In early 1936, I published my best-known work called The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. In it, I developed a theory that could explain the determination of aggregate output and, as a consequence, employment. The determining factor is aggregate demand. Unemployment is possible and cannot be cured by reducing wages. The demand for money is based on liquidity preference. Government fiscal and monetary policy can help eliminate recessions and control economic booms. Most of my ideas later became known as macroeconomics. In 1944, I led the British delegation to the International Conference in Bretton Woods, where the details of the post-war economic order were hammered out. By then, my already precarious health deteriorated, and, alas, I died in 1946.
All right, scholars. Now, John Maynard Keynes really believed the idea was the fact that if we look at the gross domestic product, which we'll learn more about, the gross domestic product is the total dollar value of all goods and services produced within a given year. Okay? The gross domestic product is essentially what the country sells in 1 year. And we'll learn the determining factors for it. One of the keys is it has to be new, Okay, and it can't be a intermediate good. For example, flour is an intermediate good. Brownies are manufactured or a finished product. Brand new house, that is what we call part of the GDP. But at the same time, a house built in 1978, sold in 2014, that's not part of the GDP, but the real estate fees would be part of the GDP. A used car, not in the GDP for this year, but it would be in the GDP for 2014 if you sold it on eBay, and eBay charges some fees there. So that's what any kind of service, anything, a haircut, okay, a little off the sides, not too much off the top, a haircut, dinner out, those are all part of the GDP. So what Keynes was trying to say was, if we look at one of these different models here, okay, that's the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. The idea is, if we just take a minute and move to here, the aggregate expenditure graph, and we'll learn more about this. This is what we call price level. This is the real GDP. The GDP in constant, unchanging dollars. Here is full employment. Full employment is generally regarded as 4 to 6% unemployment. It's generally regarded as 4 to 6% unemployment. That means everybody is working and there's only a few people out of work, 4 to 6% of the population. You don't want everyone working. It sounds crazy, but that causes the economy to overheat and causes inflation. If everybody's working, then there's no way a company could grow. There's no way the economy could grow. The economy wants to constantly grow. That's one of the things. Growth, innovation, okay? Those are some of the goals of the economy. And you can't have growth and innovation if every single person is working. A lot of people just simply don't work, and we'll learn more about it because of things like frictional unemployment. Take this job and shove it. The old Johnny Paycheck song. You know, people just quit. They quit jobs, they go back to school, they go to school, they leave school, things like that, or they decide it's too much snow, I can't take all this, it's too cold, I'm moving to Florida. Okay? And they lose their jobs or they quit. Those are the most common form of unemployment. So what Keynes said was, if we take the GDP and we break it down into C, which is consumption by consumers, and I, which represents business investment, okay? If I represents business investment, and G, which represents government spending, if we take the GDP, and what he focused on was aggregate expenditure, AE, aggregate expenditure, and here we see an aggregate expenditure graph, C plus I plus G, okay? And we don't factor what's called, we're not going to worry about it right now, NX, which is net exports, which is imports minus exports. What Keynes came up with was this brilliant idea. Believe it or not, out of C, meaning consumers, consuming goods and services, I, business investment, and G, government spending. The one that is the greatest is consumption, believe it or not, by about 3/4. The rest is business and then the government. Yes, the government spends a lot of money, but businesses paying salaries, wages are the biggest expense for any business in general, all things constant. So therefore, consumption is the overwhelming largest part of the economy. Well, if we have a situation here where the economy is in a recession, and this is causing a gap between where it needs to be here at equilibrium and down here, and let's say consumers aren't spending money, what could happen is, according to Keynes, the government can prime the economy. How could it do that? By creating work projects, by creating spending. The government decides to build more highways. Well, now the government builds more highways. In the United States, we have what's called a fractional reserve system. When you put your money in a bank, they don't sit there and say, oh, okay, here's your money. We're going to keep it right here in this little box. And when you come to get it, your money will be right here waiting for you. No, what they do is they take your money and they loan it out. And generally speaking, they only have to hold 10%. So they take $100 that you deposit in the bank, and $90 gets lent out to that person, to Fred. And then out of that $90, he deposits it, okay, 10%, $9 stays in there, and then 81 goes to Sally. And then $81 could be lent out to Sally. Sally deposits that, $8.10 stays in the bank, and then out of the $8.10, $73 or something like that is available for Dwayne to take for his, to buy some bigger cowboy hats or something to that effect. So we have a fractional reserve system. So for example, if the government decides to make a $500 billion public works project to rebuild the highways, essentially that would create 10 times 500 billion, or 5 trillion in spending, which could take this gap, if this was $5 trillion, and get our economy where it's supposed to be. So the idea is the government is supposed to use a policy called fiscal policy. Okay? Fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is the idea of taxing and spending. Now this is where it gets a little weird. When the economy's in good shape, we are supposed to increase taxes and decrease spending and create a surplus, according to Keynes. And when the economy's in bad shape, we're supposed to decrease taxes and increase spending and create a deficit, according to Keynes. Problem is, fiscal policy is done by the President, the Office of the President, and Congress. And they're politicians, they're not economists. So how many politicians would people vote for if they came out and said, how y'all doing? I see y'all business is doing mighty fine. The economy's doing great. Unemployment's low, 3.5%, y'all. I just want y'all to understand, because of that, in Keynesian economics, it is time for us to raise your taxes. I know you'd like me to keep them low, but if I want to be fiscally responsible, I got to raise y'all taxes, because that's the way it's supposed to be. We've got to be fiscally responsible. And I know you're looking for that little bit of money to help out at the Little League field, but that federal government grant, we can't do that, because now we've got to cut back spending and help keep and pace the economy out. Because y'all understand, we have to raise taxes because the economy's good. Yeah, that politician would get 0 votes. But that's what happens. That's what should happen. But what they have is when the economy's bad, they raise taxes and decrease spending. And when the economy's good, they lower taxes and increase spending and cause a deficit. They do the opposite. And that messes everything up. Because what we have, and hopefully the sun's not making too much of a glare, we have what's called the natural business cycle within our economy. And the natural business cycle has periods of ups and downs. Okay? A indicates a period of expansion. B indicates a period of contraction. So the government is trying to make periods of expansion longer. And if they do that, they raise taxes and decrease spending to pace it out to prevent something like, let me just get rid of that for a second, to prevent something like an inflationary gap from occurring. And that would be indicated by this line being up here. Now we have an inflationary gap. So the government tries to extend periods of expansion, pardon me, by taking taxes and making those taxes go up and decreasing spending. Therefore, when we're in a period of contraction to lessen the effects of it, the government lowers taxes and increases spending and creates a deficit or uses its surplus. So this way they get to pace out the economy, because if the government didn't pace out the economy, then you get this situation for a business cycle. And which is easier to deal with? The yellow line or the red line? You'd have massive periods of rapid expansion with inflation and then crashes, and then expansion and then crashes. Expansion, crashes. And that makes it hard to predict what a job of an economist is to do. is to make predictions based on 3 to 6 month periods. So therefore, because of Keynes, the idea is we show on this graph when the economy has an inflationary gap, the government reduces spending, which would have a multiplier effect and bring the economy down, or if the economy was in a recession, here we go. Sorry. Forget it. If the economy is in a recession, I can't pull down the line. But what would happen if the economy is here? The government would spend money and pump from it and get it back to where it needs to be, back to equilibrium. And that's the idea that Keynes brought forth. Okay? We have 3 different graphs here that are important for you folks to see. Okay? Let's just go back one. This is the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. When we talk about short-run aggregate supply, price levels on the y-axis, real GDP is on the x-axis. We have short-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate demand, and full employment. Right now, this would be an economy in equilibrium. If we had it where the long-run aggregate supply curve was to the left of this straight line, we'd have a recession. If we had it over here, we'd have inflation. Okay? Inflation is a general rise in prices. It's not a terrible thing. But the problem with inflation is the fact that, simply the fact that if it's too much and it gets too high, prices get too high, people stop spending. When they stop spending, recessions start to occur. This is the Keynesian graph, okay, the Keynesian model that he used. Real GDP and price level. Here is our short-run aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply. Let's see if we can move this one. Yep. When we're in this zone here, we're in a period of contraction because we don't have any growth in price. Price stays stagnant. When we're here, we're in a period of expansion because prices are rising and real GDP is growing. Increasing in prices isn't bad. When we talk about inflation, we talk about creeping inflation. That's good inflation. That's when we have 1 to 3% in increase inflation. We want increases in inflation. We want prices to rise slowly because that means growth. For example, how many of you would like a raise every year? I know I would. That's an example of inflation. But if it gets out of control, we only have prices going up but no growth. That's inflation. So in this situation, Keynes would want the government to stop spending money and increase taxes. In this situation over here, he'd want the government to start spending money and decrease taxes. And that's the way it would work. Okay? So that's what we see with those. At the same time, let me just see something. Yeah, this is not the one we're looking for. I'll just send this one out. This is a PowerPoint on when we show you aggregate supply, aggregate demand, what affects it. Let me just open that up real quick, though, the one I want to show you. This is just like the classroom. Sometimes you got to take a minute here to open this stuff up. Here we go. Just give me a minute, scholars. Hopefully we're still taping. We're having a tough time here. Thought I had it right there, but is this it? No. What's the one? I just want a better one for you guys, sorry. Alright. Well, I'll just upload it to the site. But the truth is, we'll learn more about this later on, is what we'll learn later on is that, believe it or not, supply creates demand. When we talk about aggregate supply and aggregate demand, supply creates demand. Nobody asked for an iPad to be made. Makers of Apple, Apple decided to create an iPad, to create a tablet, to simplify the personal computer. Now everybody wants one. So that's what I really want to show you in aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And we'll see that as well. Oh wait, I think it might, of all places. Yeah, it's right here. Okay. So here you'll probably want to pause for a minute and take down the notes if you want. But what causes changes in aggregate demand are all the following. Tax decreases. Let's just do that again. Oh, okay. Let's just restart it from the beginning. We lost it for a second. Okay. So what causes changes in aggregate demand is any type of tax decrease. This is an argument that a lot of conservatives make in government. Decrease taxes, it increases spending. Somewhat true. Increase amount of money in circulation. We'll learn about that more with monetarism. A reduction in real interest rates. Okay? Meaning if it's cheaper to borrow money, people borrow more of it. A drop in the foreign value of the exchange. We'll learn about that more with international trade. If the dollar is weak, our goods and services overseas can be bought in much greater quantity. And if people feel good about consumer confidence, that always increases the aggregate demand. When people feel good, that's great. But when they don't feel good, that's bad. For example, one of the troubling things I just saw in the paper today was half of the Americans in the country have more in credit card debt than they do in emergency funds. So eventually what's going to happen with those people is they're going to stop spending money. So that's going to drop C, which could hurt our growth of the economy. And one of the reasons is we'll learn more about it. And a lot of political talk comes up with macroeconomics, but a lot of it has to do with minimum wage being so low. What causes a decrease in aggregate demand is the opposite of the list. Ha 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 ha. But now what causes increases in aggregate supply? Any type of new raw materials, more competition. For example, we have the iPads, we have the other types of tablets, the Nook, the Kindle, okay? Reduction of international trade barriers. Even though the New Deal didn't really solve the Great Depression, what really solved it was World War II. One of the problems during the Great Depression is all these classical economists decided to put up protective tariffs, cutting off their borders from any trade. And because they cut off their borders from any trade, what happened as a result of that was there was no international trade, which hurt economies even more, because the world already had become globally interdependent. Okay? There was interdependence amongst all these nations. They didn't realize it. So the World War II opened up the economy. But it is a fallacy. War is bad for the economy. It is. The 1960s really showed that. When Lyndon Baines Johnson fought a war on poverty to help lift people out of poverty, because 1/4 of the nation was living in poverty, but at the same time fighting the war in Vietnam, what happened with that is it caused rampant inflation and hurt the economy for decades after that. Any type of increasing training and education. The more you have, the better educated people are. That means they're more efficient workers. We learned about that. They're more productive. Decreasing in taxes and any reduction in the cost to produce a good or service. But here's the idea we're talking about. A macroeconomic analysis, aggregate demand sets prices, and aggregate supply sets levels of production. Consumption, business investment, government, net exports, imports minus exports. Aggregate supply, labor, capital, both physical and financial capital, technology, okay, sets levels of production. So we learned that as well, okay? Chicken or the egg? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Okay. Aggregate supply creates aggregate demand. That's the way it works. Okay? And you can see that in a different textbook. But you'll probably find that in your text as well when we start reading. Alright, so we saw that, change in aggregate supply and aggregate demand. We saw the graphs. We already got that. Let's move down. Okay, so this is all taken care of by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, where they try to figure out essentially where the economy is. During the 1920s, every single sign was there that the economy was headed for a crash, but nobody was watching. There was no gauges. There was no unemployment gauge. There was rising unemployment. There were over inventories. People were buying like wild on credit, just like in 2007. 2007, there were all the signs for an economic downfall. To the degree which it happened, not that, would have been hard to really predict that, but there was signs for that. 2007 was the first time since 1932 the U.S. savings rate was negative. People spent more than they saved. In 1932, the reason why that was occurring was people took money out of savings to pay for food, to pay their rent. In 2007, people did that to buy their SUVs and their large screen TVs. So therefore, it told you that the economy was overheating and it was heading for a crash. Okay? But the idea is now, with the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they can use all these different gauges to figure out what's going on with the economy. Consumption, see how households are doing, businesses, the government, and what have you. We'll learn about this. Inflation does help some people, but it does hurt others. It doesn't measure non-market activities. For example, if I clean my house, I could hire somebody, but it is cheaper for me to do it myself, but I don't get paid. I don't pay myself. And it doesn't measure the underground economy, all that illicit activity out there, you know what I'm saying? It doesn't do it in like illegitimate gambling, drug use, what have you. Okay? And one of the things that GDP will learn about, one of the key negatives, or not negatives, but one of the key disadvantages of the GDP is simply the fact, or limitation, is that it doesn't measure the quality of life for a nation. Okay? So that's kind of the ideas we see there. We saw this already. Okay. So quickly we'll take a look at this and we'll move on. The key economic challenges that the United States always faces because of macroeconomics tries to essentially eliminate these problems. One of them is unemployment. That is a challenge. Another one is price stability. Or better known as inflation. And last but not least, poverty. And we'll address these throughout macroeconomics. Okay? Price stability has pretty much been handled for the last 20 or something years because of a monetary policy called monetarism. And we'll learn more about that. Monetarism is the belief that macroeconomic stabilization can be achieved through adjusting the nation's money supply. How could that be done? It's really not that difficult. A lot of macroeconomics will be using, you're going to want to remember how to do some math. A lot of macroeconomics is based on a lot of the questions are based on the simple idea of percent over 100 and part over total. And that's a lot of the math problems, okay? When you do that old math formula, percent over 100, part over total, and cross multiply everything, and you come up with the answer. Because we're going to want to figure out how inflation is about, or what's the GDP at, or what's the unemployment rate at, or what's the labor participation rate. So you're always figuring what's the percent out of 100 over part over total. But generally speaking, we haven't had to deal with price stability because of monetarism, because of the Federal Reserve manipulating how much money is out there. When the economy is bad, we put more money into supply. How do we do that? One of the simplest ways is lower interest rates to make the demand for money greater. And when the economy is doing really well, we raise interest rates to decrease the demand for money to stop inflation. Poverty still remains a problem today in the United States. We had, with this past recession, a large amount of people rising up. The amount of people in poverty is about 1 in 9, or about 16% of the nation is impoverished. And we'll learn more about what that means. These are the different types of unemployment that are out there. Structural means, and you want to pause, maybe write this down. Structural means when workers' skills don't match the job market. That's the worst one. There's nothing worse than that. That means a robot replaces a worker. Terrible situation. Frictional unemployment is when people quit. Seasonal is because, for example, construction workers get laid off, especially like with this bad winter. And cyclical is the business cycle. So those are different types of unemployment out there, but structural is the worst. For example, that's a problem when people get out and when their jobs are outsourced. Now they have skills that no longer match the job market. Full employment is when we talk about 4 to 6% of the population is employed. We discussed that. We already learned about inflation. Okay, it's a general increase in prices. We'll learn about this as well. Inflation is calculated using the CPI or an urban market basket. The whole idea about macroeconomics is addressing the problems that the nation has and using fiscal policy and monetary policy to take care of that. Okay? Here are the different types of inflation. Creeping is the most desirable. That's 1 to 3% inflation. The chronic slows the economy down. Dude, when you have chronic inflation, it's like double digit. People stop buying and stop working. Yeah, chronic inflation is double digit. Hyperinflation is when the economy actually collapses. That's when your money is worthless. Argentina back in the 2000s was one of the most recent nations where their economy collapsed because the money was worthless. Germany during the 1920s. Okay, what causes inflation? There's a couple, and you may want to stop, pause, take quick notes. But quantity is when it's too much money in the economy that leads to inflation. When there's just too much money printed. Cost push, for example, gas prices double, prices would rise, that's a cost push. And that could create what's called the wage price spiral. Now that prices are so high, I want more money, I need more money, that raises the cost, which raises prices, which causes an upward spiral. And the demand pull theory. That's when the demand for a good or service pulls up the price. Okay. The problem with when we talk about inflation, key is erodes purchasing power. And these are the major causes of poverty. The two most largest causes of poverty is people who don't have a high school diploma. 90% of people live in poverty do not have a high school diploma. The overwhelming majority of people live in poverty are single mothers with their children. It's just how it is, unfortunately. Yeah, not everybody ponies up to be a good parent, unfortunately. These are just different policies. Here's the poverty rate. We see that big jump in this last 5 years to 15% in 2012. It's right now around 16%. There's talk of raising minimum wage. It could take almost 1 million people out of poverty. We'll see what happens about that. Okay, scholars, we're going to be winding down. So even though we were off for a week, we're never off. I'll have a little assignment that goes with this as well to introduce macroeconomics. But now we're looking at the economy as a whole and what can the government do and what policies can it make to adjust the economy. All right, a lot of information at once, but it gives you a good overview of what we'll be studying as we go to finish this course in AP Economics. All righty, we'll speak to you.